Hey everyone, welcome back to the Leadership Project with your host Mick Spiers. Our vision is to inspire all leaders to challenge the status quo. We bring you weekly topics and thought-provoking guests to get you to stop, reflect, and think about what it means to be a leader in a modern world. Our aim is to help you become the leader you wish you always had, as we learn together and lead together. Today's episode is brought to you by my new book, You're a Leader, Now What? The Proven Path to High-Performance Leadership. The book contains many of the great lessons that we've been learning together during the Leadership Project podcast, together with many other lessons that I've collected over my 30-year career as a leader. The book is aimed at first-time leaders, but really there's lessons in there for everyone. It would be greatly appreciated if you could go and grab your copy on Amazon as either an ebook or a paperback, and if you could leave us an honest review on Amazon. Now, on with the show. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm deeply honored today to be joined by someone, and I'm not exaggerating here, who changed the way I see the world. And there's very few people that I could say fit into that category. We are joined by Jeff Bloomfield. He's the founder and CEO of Braintrust. He's a speaker, a growth expert, and self-confessed brain enthusiast. And we're going to talk about that. I love that term instead of the typical, I'm a neuroscientist, which he is. I love this term, brain enthusiast, and we're going to be talking a lot about neuroscience today. He's also the best-selling author of 2 books, Neuroselling and Story-Based Selling, and we'll be going into elements of both of those today. And ultimately what he does is he works with sales teams around the world to increase their influence, their impact, and their results. And you're probably already wondering, well, okay, is this episode all going to be about sales? Well, not really. And we will be talking about the science of sales as we go through this, but really we'll be talking about the science of how people make decisions. How do people trust each other? So the science of trust. And we'll be weaving that towards the things that Jeff has become a deep expert in and what they could mean to you and your leadership. So without any further ado, I'm going to explain how I come across Jeff, which is a really interesting story. We first met each other 36,000 feet in the air, somewhere between Australia and the Middle East. And I was on my way to France for a sales conference. And that's a very long flight for those that don't know. It's 24 hours that you spend in a tin can. And I was looking to pass some time, and I stumbled across a LinkedIn learning session about the science of sale by this guy, Jeff Bloomfield. And that was a world-changing moment for me. Everything that Jeff said to me made me see the world in a different way, and I've never thought any differently since. So much to the point where I even changed all of the presentations that I was going to do at that sales conference based around the things that I was learning from Jeff. Since then, we've got to meet each other and do more work with each other. I've had him present at sales conferences for companies that I've worked for, always with an amazing impact. So I feel like I'm selling him right up here to tell you just how impactful it is. But literally one of 3 people that I could say has had a lasting impact on the way that I see the world. So without further ado, Jeff, please introduce a little bit more about your background. And what I'm really curious to know is how a farm boy from Ohio discovers neuroscience.
Yeah, those don't even seem like they should go together, do they?
No, they don't. So yeah, let's hear it.
Well, first, Mick, I should think about taking you along with me to do all of my introductions to all of my keynotes and all of the times that I'm speaking to audiences. That was very, very flattering. Thank you for that. And I think that those that are listening to you also probably hold you in the same regard with the work that you're doing and the impact that you're having on them, both as leaders and as human beings. So kudos to you for that. And thank you for who you are and what you're doing in the world. So appreciate you, brother. Well, you asked the question, how's a farm boy from Ohio in the United States end up in neuroscience? And it was a fairly interesting circle and cycle of events as I weaved my way through my own journey. I had a grandfather, my papaw, and he was from Kentucky, which, if you're familiar with the United States, is a little bit more southern. And he didn't have anything. He was dirt poor, and he moved up to Ohio when my dad was just a little boy, and he took his life savings and he wanted a different life for the next generation. And he was my guy. He was my mentor, my sage. I was attached to his hip. He taught me how to drive when I was 5, standing between his knees on our old green John Deere tractor. And I think one of my next books is going to be everything I needed to know in life I learned on the farm. Because when you really reflect back on the things that you've learned and the people who've taught them to you, you can really start to appreciate those life lessons. Like Papaw's, hard work and perseverance, right? It always pays off. He had this belief that problem solvers rule the world, that with enough creativity and ingenuity, in our case, sometimes a little bit of duct tape, you could solve just about any problem. He had this belief that the way you treated a person was a measure of who you felt or how you felt about yourself. And so we call it the platinum rule. You don't treat people better than, or don't treat people how you want to be treated. Treat them better than they expected you to treat them. And so you start to think about all these less life lessons you pick up. And the other big belief that he had was family matters more than anything else. And long after your friends and colleagues are gone, your family's probably who remains. So you got to treat them accordingly along the journey. And what does this have to do with neuroscience? Well, on February 2nd, 1982, I got off the school bus to see Papaw like I did every day. And normally it was just his green Chevy Silverado. Well, on this day, it was full of cars. Now, as I headed down that 50-yard long driveway, I knew something was up, but I didn't know what. Well, it didn't take long to recognize when the ambulance came down the driveway that something was terribly wrong. And when they took my Papaw out on the stretcher that day, I didn't know it. It'd be the last day that I'd ever get to see him alive. I was devastated. He had stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer, and he never told me. And he slipped into a coma that day. And February 2nd, 1982 will always live in infamy, seared in my limbic system as a pivotal crossroads for me. Because it was really at that moment I was faced with the weight of what he really wanted was a legacy of me being the first person in our family to go to college. I didn't really think much about it at the time, prior to his death, but afterwards it really hit me. Like, man, he made a lot of sacrifices so that I could be in a position to go to college. And so I did. Why does that matter? How does that get us to neuroscience? Well, I ended up in biotech and I got to help commercialize a drug for lung cancer. How about that? And so I'm a person of faith, so that I felt like there was a divine purpose and path for what was happening. And as I kind of moved my way through this organization, I started to recognize, Mick, that the way that I was being trained to communicate was in complete opposite and really counter to the way my Papaw communicated. He was a storyteller. He was a teacher. He had that ability to really take metaphors and analogies and props and stories and help you discover for yourself what you should do through the art of storytelling, through the art of the way that he connected with people. And yet I was being trained to communicate with people the opposite. I had to learn everything I could about cell biology, cell proliferation, randomized placebo-controlled phase 3 study data. Go tell the oncologist that we called on this information. I'm like, well, that's opposite of the way Papaw got people to discover for themselves the reason to change. So I just kept communicating like Papaw, and I'll fast forward to the punchline as I made my way up the organization, because who knew that communicating this way was more successful than the other way? They asked me to launch a drug for brain cancer. And as I built this team and helped the leadership, the other leaders build this team, I began to recognize that there was new technology, brain imaging technology, functional MRI, EEG, ECG, that was allowing us to peer into the brain like we'd never seen before. And at first I was fascinated from a biological standpoint, right? For folks with brain cancer and understanding the blood-brain barrier and nobody cares, blah, 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 right? But then as I started to look deeper, I started to recognize, and even talking to neurobiologists and neuroresearchers, hey, wait a minute. The brain lights up in very different places based on how it's communicated with. Why are people not looking at this? And they didn't care because they were looking at it through the academic lens right? Or through the healthcare lens. They weren't really looking at it through the communication lens. And I thought to myself, well, wow, there's some patterns here that really are intriguing. So the more we began researching it, looking into it, the more we found that it's really to be a great world-class communicator. Whether you're in sales, marketing, whether you're a leader, whether you're a coach, whether you're a parent, a spouse, to be a world-class communicator, you have to understand that it's a combination of biology, physiology, and psychology. And you have to recognize that it's not just about knowing the right information. And it's not just about communicating it the right way. As it turns out, and now we know this with neuroscience, you have to do it in the right order. And when you do, you facilitate an environment where people are much more open and willing to change. So that's the journey from the farm to the lab, to the functional MRI machine, and now back out into commercial corporate world where we're helping people hopefully do just that, which is communicate with more impact.
Wonderful, Jeff. Thank you for sharing that with that great detail and great storytelling at the same time. So you're kind of proving your point at the same time. That I want to acknowledge there, you're obviously a very purpose-driven person, and your papa clearly has had a huge impact on your life and continues to do so, to the point where you remember so many vivid details about him and the lessons that he shared with you when he was alive and the impact of when he passed. And I'm sorry to hear of his passing. I'm not sorry to hear of the impact that he's had on you as a person and how he's set you up to then go and have this great impact that you now have on the world. So with every kind of sadness there of the story of his passing comes the silver lining that you must be making him very proud every single day. Well,
Mick, let me say one thing on that, because I think it's so important to the leaders that are listening. I think about today the ripple effect, butterfly effect, if you will. And I think about, my papaw dropped a single pebble in a pond. The ripple effect it had is now I, here, 2 generations later, am having an impact on people around the world. And not because of me, but because he took a risk to leave a legacy, to drop a pebble. He just had an 8th grade education. He worked in a steel mill and he farmed. Yet he had a vision that the next generation could have a broader impact. And he just wanted to paint the picture that there's more out there than the farm, or in our case, the farm and the steel mill. And so with the leaders that are listening, sometimes you can get caught on the treadmill every day, the task list of whatever you're running, whatever team you're leading, whatever company you're at. And you lose sight of the fact that every single day you have an opportunity to drop a pebble. And you don't really know how far those ripples will go. But as leaders, we have responsibility to recognize that our legacy is leaving the ripples to the folks that are going to take the good from us that we've instilled in them and have a broader impact than we could ever hope, dream, or imagine. So I think about that a lot in that kind of leadership legacy piece.
There's a powerful message there, Jeff, that I want to play on. We do get into this kind of learned helplessness at times where we think that one person can't change the world. And yes, maybe the actions of one person can't change everything in the world, but that ripple effect that you talk about, that multiplication of impact, it needs to start somewhere. So it needs to start with that first pebble that is dropped to create that ripple effect. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's important for us all to learn. You might be, sorry to go on a little sidetrack here, you might be a leader that's working in a toxic culture and you think, well, how am I going to change this? Well, if you don't try, it never will. So drop that first pebble. I love that, Jeff. Thank you for sharing that. Let's get to that message there about communication. So now you're in neuroscience and you're getting access to these kind of technology, MRIs, etc., that can show what the brain is doing. And what I'm hearing from you is that we're seeing biological changes in the brain based on the way that we communicate, based on the way that we receive and communicate information. And you spoke about it changing with specific sequences. Can you tell us more about that sequence?
Yeah, and I think there's, you don't know what you don't know, right? And as humans, we evolve through the acquisition of information, and we try to do research, and we try to we're in a constant pursuit of new and learning and understanding as human beings. That's why, as a species, we're continuing to evolve and come up with better technologies and great ideas. And it's a wonderful thing that's kind of built into us. When it comes to communication, though, this is what I find somewhat ironic. So Elon Musk has been in the news lately because he just bought a chunk of Twitter, and he's arguably one of the most, I would say, innovative thinkers of our generation. Whether you like him or not, it's irrelevant. It's hard to argue that he's innovative. And I think about what makes someone innovative. I'll get to the science piece in a second. And if you listen to him talk, he actually credits first principles reasoning as a way to build every company he's ever built, which dates all the way back to Aristotle. Well, first principles reasoning says that when you're approaching something, you have two ways of innovating. You can either take a box that somebody else has built and try to make the box iteratively better, or you can break the walls of the box down and not even use a box and start with the fundamental truths of what you're trying to solve for, and then build up without any preconceived idea of what's possible. And that's first principles reasoning. And that's how he's built SpaceX and Tesla and all of his companies. And I think about that from the standpoint of communication. This brings us back to the science. So 11 years ago, when I started Braintrust, and I didn't know this was first principles reasoning at the time, by the way, so I don't want to sound like I was a complete Aristotle nut back 11 years ago. What I did do, though, I thought, okay, I've been through, countless training programs over the course of my career, whether it was in sales, whether it was marketing frameworks, whether it was leadership coaching platforms. I've been through all of them. I worked for the world's leading biotech company. I had unlimited resources for development, basically. And what I recognized is that none of them, not a single one of them, had any scientific undergirding, any scientific foundation. At best, they had some psychology. And then when I got to looking into the psychology, it really wasn't validated psychology. It was stuff that someone had created 30, 40 years ago, and they thought it was the way to do things. So I started with this idea, the premise that let's break down the box. I don't want to iteratively make a different sales program or a different coaching program or leadership, blah, blah, blah. I want to start with no walls in the box, just looking at the science. What do we know about the brain today that we didn't know 30 years ago? And how does that impact how people communicate? And so let's break it down. Back in the late 1960s, the triune brain theory became in vogue. And that was the idea that the brain has three layers, right? It has the neocortex and then the limbic system and then the reptilian brain, or the root brain, we call it. And I looked at that first and I thought, okay, well, that's really interesting. And I like that. And at the time, they didn't think it was necessarily built and rooted in too much neuroscience. But now as we've advanced with technology, we're able to start to map it. So I was comparing this to what was out there with left brain thinking, right brain, all that kind of stuff, which was really more psychological than it was biological. And as we started to look at the sequence of communication and using functional MRI and EEG, Dr. Tony Jack, who's Dr. Dan on my team's kind of research partner for his dissertation, he decided to see if he could actually validate this. And he broke the brain, instead of three networks, into two: the analytical network, the neocortex, and then the emotional empathic network, the limbic and the reptilian, limbic and the root. And he found out that every single human being in his test, which was thousands, all processed information the exact same way, regardless of where they were from in the world, regardless of their gender, regardless of their socioeconomic background. And what he started to see was these two networks activated based on what was communicated. And the interesting thing was the analytical network did not have the capacity for change or innovation. It was biologically designed for evaluation, analysis, comparison, judgment. It was the emotional empathic network where you contain your internal visualization and all things like emotions and trusts and feelings. And it's the area of our brains, regardless, again, of socioeconomic, gender, backgrounds, culture. That's where we actually initiate all decision-making. And then we look to recruit information to validate and justify that emotional decision. And so I started thinking about this, Mick, and I thought, wow, so if I just went to 10 random people in the street and I said, you're an emotional decision maker, how many of those people would have reacted that positively? Zero. Because the psychologists over the decades have said, well, you can't be, there's emotional people and then there's rational people, right? No, we're all emotional decision makers who look to justify and validate with information, every single one of us. And so when we are able to validate this, and with Dr. Jack's work, we found that you actually can't activate both networks at the same time. You have to vacillate between them. You can do it very quickly, mind you, but you have to vacillate between them. And so I started to look at this data and research and said, okay, well, let's test it. Let's start looking at, if I just communicate facts to people, what happens? It activates their analytical network, puts them into defense mode, puts them into evaluation, comparison, compared to status quo mode. It puts them in a position to start to feel like they have to justify their current way of thinking and doing versus being open to new ideas. And the more information I give them, the deeper they dig in their heels to not change. Interesting. Does that ever change? No, it doesn't. So when you think about it as a leader, think about it as a salesperson, think about it as a parent. If I activate your analytical network with data, facts, information, you are automatically going to be evaluating and comparing that to what you believe, what you're currently doing, and how do you need to defend yourself against what you're currently doing compared to what this person is telling you should do. Now think about that and the implications that has on change. How many leaders listening today go in and tell somebody what they need to do different or manage people? You can't manage people. You have to lead people. You can only manage process. So to the extent that we communicate in a way that activates the analytical network, we're processing lots of information. The receivers can process almost unlimited amounts of data, but it doesn't drive change. It actually tends toward driving the unwillingness to change. So the idea that you could activate the emotional empathic network first, and then do what we call the emotion coaster, where you know the right information to communicate based on the situation, to activate the right part of the brain that puts the person in a better state biologically to be willing to change. That was game changing. And when those light bulbs went off for us, and for me specifically, I said, there's nothing out there like this. No one's talking about this and then giving people a model and a framework and some coaching around how to do that as a professional communicator. So I probably went too far in the weeds than what you're hoping for, but
no, that was brilliant, Jeff. I want to summarize it to help kind of codify some of the big takeaways there. I'm going to start with, I mentioned earlier that there's 3 people in my life that fundamentally changed the way I see the world, and you're one of them, and the 2 others are Simon Sinek and Martin Seligman. And Seligman's about joy, fulfillment, and flow state, etc. It's a different topic. But Simon Sinek has stumbled across the same thing that you are, but he came across it a different way. What he did was just codify what he saw was working. So he saw people out there that were speaking in a certain sequence and go, oh, okay, that's different and it's working, right? Whereas what you've done is proven that in science through watching MRIs and seeing which parts of the brain activate through different types of information to prove scientifically what we've been thinking here, that people make decisions emotionally and they justify them rationally. And I've got a dear friend that will be listening to this show, Jeff, that will swear black and blue that he's analytical and he uses spreadsheets for everything. He's going to buy a new car, spreadsheet. He's going to make an investment decision, spreadsheet. But I guarantee you, because I watch him from the side, I guarantee you he makes an emotional decision about that car and then he uses his spreadsheet to make him feel good about the decision and go, oh yeah, well it's got ABS braking, it's got this, et cetera, et cetera. But he's 100% making that emotional decision. The other bit that I want to also go into is what you said about change. So the neocortex and the analytical part of the brain is resistant to change. It doesn't want to unlearn what it already thinks is true and makes it difficult for you to discover anything new. And you need to unlearn what you think you already know before you can learn anything new. So now what I'm hearing from you, Jeff, to summarize all that, always remember that people make decisions emotionally and justify it rationally. That if you want to convince someone of a new way of seeing the world, you need to use the roller coaster ride that Jeff is talking about. Start with emotion. You need to put in some of that rationality because that's going to help them defend their decision that they make, but it's not going to help them make the decision. And I'm sure everyone in the audience has heard the term analysis paralysis. If you just give someone 16 facts as to why your way is the best way, forget it. But if you can go emotion, fact, emotion, fact, emotion, and finish on emotion, so they're still in a decision-making process, then you're on your way to convincing them of a new way of thinking. How's that summary sit with you, Jeff?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think the idea, and I mentioned this earlier, the idea that's really hard for certain personality types, myself included, is I'm a teller, right? I like to teach. I like to speak. I like to tell people the answer. When the reality is, it's my kryptonite as an influencer, because all human beings have to choose to receive that they've chosen to change, or that they've adopted, they're choosing a new path, they're choosing to change. And I think that a lot of leaders sometimes want a shortcut. I do it here. I do it at Braintrust. I do it all the time. I'm not good always at drinking my own Kool-Aid. And I think so our instinct as communicators, when you know the answer, depending on your personality type, is just to fast forward to the answer so you can move on to something else. And as leaders who are leading people, the hardest thing, by the way, same as parents, the hardest thing that you can do is slow yourself down and create an environment where the people that you're leading are choosing to do something different. It is so hard, especially when you know what you're asking them to do is the right thing to do, and yet they still won't do it. Have you ever been there? Anybody? No. Have you ever been a parent? No.
Everyone, right? Yeah.
I want to comment on one other thing you said. I think it's important for folks to know is we actually, as human beings, you actually can't unlearn something. You can forget it, but you can't unlearn it. And the reason for that is because the brain creates neural pathways every time it learns something new. And you've heard the expression as neurons fire together, they wire together, they fire together, they wire together. So as neurons fire together, they wire together. And the more times they fire down the same path, that is a behavior or a skill or ultimately a habit. And so every time you do something new over and over again, you're creating a deeper entrenched neural pathway in your brain. And so that becomes the status quo gully, a status quo chasm almost in your brain. You cannot just suddenly replace it. Like you can't unlearn it. You have to actually cut it off and create a new neural pathway around it with a new behavior. And then over time, those neurons stop firing together. They're still in there. The memory is still in there, but it stops being an active behavioral pathway. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So essentially it's displacement, not displacement or replacement, not that you will ever unlearn that. That makes a lot of sense. And that's something.
Well, and if you think about it, if you've got leaders listening who have been in some form of leadership position for longer than a couple of years, some of them maybe 20, 30 years even, think about how many leadership behavioral habits you have from a neural pathway standpoint. They are so deeply entrenched in your brain that, you can't deal with the expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That is basically a neuroscientist saying their neural pathways are so deep that they are never going to want to do the work to create a new neural pathway because they've already done this so many times that it's subconscious, unconscious, behavioral, and they don't have to think about it. So why would I want to do something different? And it's challenging as leaders to not only get others to do something different, but for you yourself to recognize that the habit or the behavior that I'm demonstrating in this leadership capacity or situation isn't optimal. So therefore, I'm going to start to work on a new behavior or habit to create a new neural pathway to kind of, to your point, supplant that old existing pathway. But it's hard. It's really hard.
Can I ask, is that where confirmation bias comes in? So where we only see and hear things that are congruent with our view of the world, that match things that we already believe to be true. Like you might go into come into your world of sales. I've seen countless times, Jeff, where a salesperson goes into a meeting and they only hear the things that they wanted to hear. And they missed all of the signals that the customer was giving of, yes, I would like to do business with you, but here are my blocking points, or here are the reasons why I can't. And they walk away from the meeting going, oh, wow, what an amazing meeting. We're going to get a sale here, because they only heard what they wanted to hear. Is that also playing here?
Yeah, cognitive biases definitely play a large part in our status quo tendencies. And I think the science would back this up. The brain is, I would argue, it's the most just incredible piece of machinery that God ever created in the entire universe. Of all the things that's been created in the universe, the human brain has to be at the top of the list. Yet, it is the laziest animal in the universe. And let me explain what I mean. So the brain is, I don't know, roughly, it's the 8-pound mass in between your ears is actually the highest calorie consumptive organ in your body. So it is constantly burning fuel. And so as a result of that, your body, your entire being is always looking for efficiencies. It's looking for ways to reduce calorie burn. And the brain is no different. So once we've established a status quo, we made a series of decisions that led to a series of behaviors that we keep doing over and over again. Somewhere in our subconscious, in our psyche, we've determined that that's the right decision, the right behavior. So therefore, anything that's I know how long it took me to create that behavior. So now anything you're telling me to do that's different or requires me to do a different behavior, my brain interprets that as, that's a lot of work. That's going to take a whole lot of effort. So we just bypass the willingness to put in the work to change. And to do that, the cognitive dissonance that's created, we start to just look for justification measures. And that's where confirmation bias comes in. That's with all the different cognitive biases. They're really shortcuts. It's the brain's shortcut to justify not changing ultimately, or to validate the reason that they've done something is the right way. And that you're wrong, I'm right. So I'm going to use cognitive biases to shortcut the willingness to change.
So I think we're on two very interesting things here that I think are connected, and I want to test that connection with you, Jeff. So the first one about resistance to change, and I think every leader needs to be thinking about this, because leadership is about change. It's about changing behaviors. It's about inspiring people into action, all of these things, right? So the first one is that your brain is naturally trying to defend what it already knows. It's trying to be efficient. It's looking for those shortcuts that you're talking about. And that's where confirmation bias and cognitive biases can come in. Then I want to circle back to something you said before that we didn't have time to summarize then, because we had something else to summarize. You spoke a lot about choice, and you made me think about William Glasser's work on choice theory. And Glasser goes through humans having 5 needs. The need for survival, which also kicks in here. The need for love and belonging, the need for power, the need for fun, and the need for freedom. And there's a big part in Glasser's work around choice theory is about the freedom of choice and the freedom from oppression, where people want to feel like they're the ones that have got their hands on the steering wheel. That even if you've told them to do something, they are still making the choice, whether they'll do it or not. And when leaders can get hold of that and go, okay, humans have a biological need to make choices and be in control of their own lives, that's a fundamental shift in how you're going to communicate to your team. How do those two connections sit with you? Am I onto something there?
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful connection. And I'm probably going to get a little controversial here, so hopefully sure. I don't go too far off the rails. We have lived through this in the last 2 years. Let me explain. The first thing you mentioned in his work was self-preservation, right? The strongest desire in a human subconscious and the human psyche is self-preservation, survival, by far, even more than all the other things you mentioned. If my brain subconsciously doesn't feel safe, it's now on heightened alert and it's not open to anything else. So first and foremost, you might think, well, Jeff, you're thinking back to when we walked out of the cave and there's this saber-toothed tiger in the bush. Well, I'm not thinking of that, but it's actually no different. Just because our environments have changed, the root brain, the reptilian brain, the limbic system, they still function as if they're still in the Serengeti. They still function as if every single environment that they're in, they have to make sure there's some type of survival and self-preservation. It drives behavior far greater than any choice of a game. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky got a Nobel Prize for this work, right? In Thinking Fast and Slow with the Prospect Theory. They found, and I'll just summarize, they found that, and they're right, we validated it, that human beings will move with urgency to change at twice the urgency to avoid a loss than they will to pursue a gain. It taps back into that inherent self-preservation mechanism. Now let me give you the real scenario. Think about this, because you said, well, humans have the need to have their hands on the wheel, to avoid oppression, to feel like they're choosing, that they're in control. Yet for 2 years, we have sat under the boot of most government restrictions in spite of science telling us the vast majority of what the government restrictions were dictating was not true. Why would we ever do that as a population? Why would a large group of people still today walk around with masks on, even though the science has dictated that it does not work? The reason, self-preservation, because there's a stronger desire for me to feel safe, even if I'm being oppressed. Now, I'm using this as an example, right? So you may be listening to this, you may not feel the same way I feel about this, and that's fine. Every country's different and every person's different. There was certainly a risk to the population, right? We know that there was a virus, that was a pandemic, and I'm using this, it's very controversial. I can't believe I'm even doing this. I like to stay away from these lightning rod issues, but it's such a good example of we as a population said, we'll do whatever it takes to be safe, whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And so we've adopted many draconian policies and accepted them as a culture because of our brain's self-preservation. And we can't even override that, even in the face of oppression. Now think about historically through time, how many times human beings have been oppressed. And the reason that they stayed oppressed, and many times, was because the oppressing bodies made them feel like they weren't safe without them. There was some fear of lack of self-preservation or survival, and that they were going to be the ones creating the environment to protect them. It's horrible, right? I'm not saying the pandemic, but in general, world history will dictate how many times have human beings sat under the foot of oppressors at the desire to feel safe. It's there, right? So back to the science piece, that's your point, the science piece, forget about all that controversial, regardless of how you feel about it. Just now, scientifically, it's really important for leaders to understand if your people on your team don't feel, and when I say the word safe, I don't mean physically, could be, hopefully not. If they don't feel psychologically safe on your team, then that's going to be every filter they have, everything you say is going to be filtered through their lens of self-preservation, which is always concurrent with elevated cortisol. And when elevated cortisol or stress is elevated in my brain because of self-preservation, I am not optimized for performance. I am not open to new ideas, and I'm only operating out of a place of resistance. So the question I have for your leaders is, how safe is your environment?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a wonderful example. And yes, it is controversial. And, we could unpack the whole masks and vaccinations for quite some time, Jeff. But that need for fight or flight is at the root of that. So the survival, I guess this is why it's called the root brain, right? At the root of it all is that need for survival, and it is no different to prehistoric man, right? So that's going to come first. Then once they get into that area, and I love that you're quantifying this, that it's twice as powerful as any other decision they're going to make will be that need for survival. And then beyond that, they want to be making choices, right? So they want to feel like they're controlling the steering wheel. So an active choice.
How do you know what the shame is, Mick? We can move off this topic, but I think it's so important today in our culture, especially here in the States. I mean, it is so you can't even have a conversation with somebody if there's even one thing that you might feel is different about what they believe. And it's such a shame. And so you can't even almost express, you likely have a very specific opinion about mask and about, I'm going to use this one more time, then we're going to move on from it, and about the vaccine. I might have the same or different opinion about the mask and about vaccine. And I love talking about this because one, it's an elephant in the room, and two, there's nothing more relevant than today's topic than this. Let's say you find out through our discussion, or maybe something I said, that we have opposite views on one of those two. Your brain has suddenly put me outside the group. I am now outside your village, because the intensity of one's belief will drive the consistency of one's behavior. And so if you have put me in the out group, and now I've been psychologically ostracized from the Mick Spiers in group, all because of a difference of opinion on something, now we can no longer communicate based on equal trust and respect for us as human beings. And it's very interesting because in the culture today, we do that subconsciously without even realizing. In the United States, it's all about Democrats and Republicans, right? It's all about, if you're one and I'm the other, it doesn't matter which side I'm on, you're in the out group. Well, guess what? Leaders do the same thing psychologically, subconsciously with their teams, and they don't even realize it. When they learn different things about their teams just by watching them and observing them, if they're not careful, their subconscious will start to categorize them, and then they will treat them differently and they will communicate with them differently. It's a really fascinating, but it's very much a Dr. Dan on my team, Dan Doherty, when he did his dissertation work on this, he found it was a strong indicator of performance was how well the leader created an environment where everyone felt inclusively heard and recognized, regardless of if their opinion was different than the leader. It was like one of the number one driving determinant factors of culture and performance.
That psychological safety and speak up culture is so important, by the way, for all kinds of reasons. And we could spend the rest of the episode just talking about that.
Right.
But that psychological safety is about the ability to be able to say your piece, to be able to speak up, and to be able to express an opinion without fear of judgment or retribution. And the leader is the number one person that can create that environment through demonstrated action and also reaction, right? So demonstrated action is by lead from the front. Here is a good example of lead from the front. Be open, be transparent, communicate openly, and then when someone does raise their hand and say, oh, I'm not sure about this, boss, I've got a different point of view, this is go time. How you respond to that is then going to set the scene for how the team feels in relation to psychological safety. The behavior that you then either reward or punish for when someone does that sets the scene for everything that's going to happen in your team. How does that sit with you?
100% agree. And again, this is a case where I'll keep using random analogies. I'm the master carpenter whose front porch is falling down sometimes with my team. They're probably outside the studio listening in right now going, Jeff's terrible at this, and how you respond in those moments. And I know that sometimes it happens. And for leaders, again, listening, I think it's really important to be willing and open to hold the mirror up every day, and recognizing as a leader, you've got this responsibility, and challenging yourself to measure how do you respond in all different scenarios with your team, because how you respond, not just verbally, body language, the whole 9 yards, to your point, it sends that signal of whether or not those team members feel comfortable enough voicing what might be a difference of opinion. And the other piece I would add to this that I think is really also very important. This gets out of the science and really more into the personality types. If you are a more type A driver type personality as a leader, which I say unfortunately, because sometimes that's what gets me in trouble, I am, and you express your opinion often, in that personality type, you create an environment where people just assume if they express a different opinion, you're just going to run over top of them. And I think that's another really important thing for a leader to think about as they hold their mirror up and they think, okay, what do I do really well and that my team really seems to respond well to? And when do I get off the rails a little bit? Are you guys, I don't know if you're we were big Ted Lasso fans, the show Ted Lasso. And his whole premise was be curious, be curious. And I think it's hard to be curious if you're always giving the answer.
Correct. Yeah. And,
right.
And you're also stifling growth, by the way, Jeff. So
totally.
You're robbing them of the opportunity for them to do their own thinking, their own journey of discovery if you're always giving that answer. And they will be wanting to please you. So they'll be looking for those body language signals, all of those things all the way along. All right, we touched on trust. And there's two things that we certainly know. And from your work, people buy from people or brands that they know, like, and trust. But they also follow leaders that they know, like, and trust. Tell us about the science of trust. What happens in the brain around this thing called trust?
And people might start to extrapolate what we've talked about already and apply it because it really does start to build upon itself. The science really does kind of build upon itself here. When you think about trust, the one thing that I didn't realize, I think, everyone knows that trust is paramount in the relationships if we've known it for the dawn of time, even if we didn't necessarily codify it. What I didn't know was, until we started looking at the research, was there's two types of trust. There's personal trust, and then there's professional trust. And the brain interprets them differently. So personal trust is that intuition that I have that I feel about you based on my observation of your honesty, authenticity, humility, and vulnerability. So if you come across as someone who's just genuinely authentic and you're humble and you seem honest and you have a spirit about you that shows that you're vulnerable enough to recognize that, you don't know all the answers. When I meet someone like that, anyone, by the way, you can't help but subconsciously like them because they feel safe, because that's how you want to be perceived. And so then I will naturally trust you on a personal level, even if I've met you for 5 minutes. There'll be something there that draws me to you personally, and a personal trustworthiness starts to form in my mind. Then on the other side of that is professional trust. So as I observe somebody's credibility, so their capability, their knowledge, their skill, their insight, like those attributes, if I perceive those to be true about you, I'll find you credible. Now, what's interesting as a leader, it doesn't matter whether this is in sales or a leadership or coaching, the human brain is still the same. Not until I feel safe am I open to what you might do to help me. So not until I'm sure you won't hurt me am I open to what you can do to help me. So as a leader, you have to remember there's two types of trust. And not until your team feels they can actually trust you at a personal level, that you've created the environment of safety and care and empathy, not without accountability, by the way, but that environment. And if I feel that about you, now I'm open to anything you have for me on the credibility side as a leader, and how you can make me better, how you will challenge me, how you'll do. And if you think about that to all the different managers or leaders you've had in your life that you've reported to, you can start to categorize them by the degrees of which they led from one of those two pillars of trust. Most of us lead from the pillar of credibility. It's how we're trained. And our instinct is, if I can show up and show them that I'm the smartest person in the room, they will follow me. It doesn't work that way. They will only follow you as long as they have to. But if I show you that I care about you and what you care about, and that I want you to succeed, and I want you to have everything you've ever dreamed about in your life, and I'm going to do everything I can as a leader in my power to help you get there. Oh, by the way, we need to do this. If you do it that way, if you change it up and you create that environment first, people will run through walls for you. And we know this. If you think about the leaders that you've done that for, that you would say, if a leader called me, I've got leaders in my life, if they called me right now and said, Jeff, I need an hour of your time, regardless of what I was doing, I'd say, tell me when. Tell me when. And there's other leaders that if you saw their number come up on your phone, you would just hit the delete button, right? Well, that's a big part of it psychologically and subconsciously.
Yeah, that's 1,000% true, Jeff. And it's one of those things, I instantly thought of the ones that I would trust to the end of the earth, right? So there's a handful of those. And I instantly thought of the ones that at the other end of the scale as well. It's very true. And it is interesting. It comes a little bit back to our sequence of communication again, if I can connect those two together. So we said before about rational versus emotional decisions. We said that previously people would start with facts and figures and I'm going to convince them of my argument, and it just doesn't work like that. You need to work on emotion, then some rationality, then some emotion, then some rationality, then some emotion. Now, when you're talking about trust, what I'm hearing from you, Jeff, is that start with safety, build personal trust, and then build professional credibility and professional trust. But how many times do we see leaders start with, I'm here, I'm your new leader, I've got an MBA from Harvard, I've done this, I've done that, and that's what they start with. Instead of starting with, I'm here for you, I'm here to look after you, I'm interested in you, you matter to me. They're the ones that nurture trust. How does that summary sit with you, Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's funny is that I don't know how many keynotes I've given over the last decade, countless, and how many meetings I've had with executives and even big, large pitches with large Fortune 50 companies. And not one time have I ever led at all with my resume, ever. In fact, I bet you that I've never done this before. We could go call the last 10 CEOs of the companies that we've really worked with the longest and ask them where I went to college. They couldn't tell you. Ask them what my degree is in. They couldn't tell you. You know why? I never told them. You know why? They don't care. And guess what? Your teams don't either. They really, truly don't. I can wow you with pedigree. And for a minute, you're going to be, he's smart. And the minute, though, that they don't think I can help them, or I don't demonstrate that my intelligence can actually lead to something valuable for them, which is what we do, by the way. We don't really truly care. We're trying to wow them with our pedigree so they'll listen to us. And that's not how it works. It's just not how it works. And now I want to address one myth, though. I think that right now, my guess is there's leaders out there and maybe some old school folks that are kind of grumbling under their breath at this comment this segment we just talked about is, it doesn't mean, I said this before, it isn't absent accountability. I think that's the myth, right? We think, well, I'm too soft. If I just try to connect with them and I really want to create that environment of safety that feels really squishy and soft. Not at all. Remember, we're doing this so that we can actually have a more aggressive accountability, because now people are desiring for high performance and they want to be coached and they want to get better, not because of what you're doing to them, but what they've seen you do for them. And that's the key, is accountability actually increases when you use this sequencing of communication as a leader. So for those out there who started to grumble under your breath, I'm telling you, if you can get this right, you'll see not only higher performance, your team will be wanting accountability.
These misunderstandings are important. I'm really glad you brought this up, Jeff. I want to expand a little bit more on this. A lot of these things that we talk about taking care of your team, and I think Simon Sinek, once again, it's another one of his, is leadership is not about being in charge; it's about taking care of those in your charge. And we speak about psychological safety, etc. Some people can interpret that as being a lovey-dovey environment. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an environment where people feel safe, and feeling safe comes with it the ability to have candor, to have high candor and low fear that high candor is going to punish you in some way. And now you're talking about accountability. No, it's not about, we've got to be soft on these people and we've got to nurture them and all this kind of stuff. No, it's about giving them the environment where their superpowers can flourish and knock it out of the park. And people want that accountability. In fact, this is another one that comes from Glasser. He talks about this in choice theory as well. They actually thrive on that accountability and they expect to see accountability around them. Everything from what behaviors in your organization are rewarded to which ones are let go or which ones are punished, etc. People are looking for that accountability because they expect to see that. So if you've got inappropriate workplace behavior, for example, where people are just turning a blind eye on, people take that as an implicit or sometimes even explicit support that behavior is okay. So no, we're not talking about lovey-dovey. We're not talking about soft. We're talking about an environment where everyone blooms.
Yep, that's right.
All right, very good. I loved our conversation on trust. The other one that you are amazing at, Jeff, is the science of storytelling. Now, I feel like we can fast forward on this one. I'm going to say that the majority of people in our audience know that storytelling works. They've sat in conferences where someone has captivated them with an amazing story that they'll always remember and the lesson that came with it. So let's just take it as an accepted that storytelling works. But my question for you is, why does it work?
Yeah, that was another one of those cases where we've heard that our whole careers, right? Storytelling, great storytellers are the best communicators. And so what it did was it gave a whole group of people who didn't feel like they were storytellers an out to not worry about being a great communicator. Well, I'm not a storyteller. I'm not like Jeff. I'm not like Jeff's Papal. That's not my approach. That's not my style. And what it turns out is, and we kind of dispelled this myth as well, it's not about, I think storytelling has almost become cliche. And it really, yes, there's a bunch of storytelling coaches, there's a bunch of storytelling models. And again, most people don't know why it works. Because once you understand why it works, you can see that it actually applies to everybody, whether you're a once upon a time storyteller or not. And what we learned with the science, if you go back to the analytical network versus the emotional empathic network. So if you think about stories, and you think about even on this podcast, when I shared early with my story with my Papal, and you think about reflecting back on that 50-yard long driveway that I described, and talking a little bit about the farm and talking a little bit about the tractor and talking a little bit about some of those things, your brain actually has to activate inside where your long-term memories are stored, where that information is visualized. And that's in the limbic system. It also activates emotional network. And so here's the last piece. It's where so you've got memory, emotion, and internal visualization. All three of those elements are located, guess where? In the emotional network, not in the analytical network. So when you tell stories, you naturally bypass the analytical network and you activate the emotional empathic network. And here's the interesting thing, Dr. Jerome Bruner found, he's one of the godfathers of cognitive psychology, that when you attach a fact to a visual element, a visual story, it's 22 times more likely to be remembered. And so, when I teach people how to do this in sales or leadership or otherwise, I say, what data or facts do you want this person to remember? Well, I wanted to remember that the driveway was 50 yards long. I wanted to remember February 2nd, 1982. So I could easily story report. And that's what a lot of people do. They say, when I was growing up on a 100-acre farm in 1982, my grandfather passed of stage 4 lung cancer. And I remember going down this 50-yard long driveway. I'll never forget it. It changed my life. I went on to college. I got a degree, and they'll story report. And it doesn't actually have the same impact. But if I tell a story with pictures and emotions, I got off the school bus. I headed down the 50-yard long driveway. Normally just this green Chevy Silverado. I'll never forget the day. It was February 2nd, 1982. Changed my life. I transport you in your limbic system into that environment. And in doing so, I just attach the facts that I wanted you to take away later. Because now it's right. I tell people it's again, earlier we said the brain is trying to be efficient. So when I story report, I activate your analytical network. You then have to evaluate the data. And then you have to determine to yourself, do I care about this? If I care about it, then I got to shove all that down in my limbic system or the emotional network. Then I have to rattle around, how much do I care about this? What's the degree of urgency or care or nurture that I want for this information? Then if I'm like, oh, I kind of do care about it, then I push it back up to the analytical network to determine if it's factual based on what I care about. It takes so much effort that the brain normally just ejects from the processing because it doesn't want to do it. So storytelling and great visual storytellers activate that empathic network because they're activating visualization, they're activating emotion, and they're putting the information right where your memory is most likely to capture it, stick it in the filing cabinet for easy retrieval. And that's the layman's version of why storytelling works so well.
Oh, that's brilliant, Jeff. I really appreciate that. I've learned so much from just listening to that. And I fit into that camp. I've always known that it works, but I've never really thought about why it works. So I really appreciate that. I want to come back to something that you did then say, and you said, some people will shy away from being a communicator and not getting on the stage. Let's use that as the example. So I'm not a storyteller. I can't do that. Any advice for people out there that have got either a limiting belief about their ability to become a storyteller, or that they want to become a storyteller, but they don't know where to start?
Yeah, I think number one, don't move into a place of shame or condemnation of yourself, because part of the limiting belief is true if it's a personality trait, but most of it is false because you believe that you're wired differently and therefore you can't fill in the blank. So when it comes to public speaking, what I tell a lot of folks is once you learn the science and you understand a little bit about how people process information differently, then if you're a very highly analytical person who's not a great storyteller, and you got to get up and give a 30-minute presentation at the company meeting in front of 1,000 people, then there's little tips that you can do that really adhere to your authenticity. Guess what? If you're a really introverted analytical person, everyone knows that. Everyone around you knows that. So if you get up and you start with a really kind of silly joke, it's so out of character that you automatically activate everyone's empathic network. And you make a joke about, and this is where self-deprecation works well to a point. If you overdo it, then it's just stupid. The other thing you can do is, and I tell folks this when we're coaching speakers a lot, the first few minutes of any talk, you have to gain that audience's attention, but you also have to reduce your own stress. And where most speakers go awry is it's that first 5 minutes. The first 5 to 8 minutes, because they're already under a bunch of stress, their cortisol squirting out their ears. And so they're communicating from their highest level of training, which is usually information. And they just want to get up there and they want to basically just unload the information on the audience. And within 5 minutes, the audience's eyes start rolling up in their head because they just don't care. And so a couple of things that I teach folks that are either not trained professional speakers or just have that kind of one big keynote they got to go give is what's the first thing you can do to disarm the audience? Tell a joke or put up an image, a cartoon, something that allows the audience to see you as human. And then what that does is it gives you a chance to let them process the joke or the visual. It allows you to take 30 seconds and just let your cortisol go down. And then you can start to engage. The other thing I say is to a lot of is what can you do to involve the audience in the first 5 minutes? And there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? You could put a survey on the screen or a funny survey. You can literally ask the audience questions and ask someone in the front row to respond. There's lots of ways. And what you're doing by that is you're involving the audience. They start to believe that you care about them as opposed to just what you want to communicate. I will completely confess to you, there are people who get so stressed out at speaking in front of more than 3 people that they lock up. And when you lock up, you're just going to rattle off information. And so the question that I always ask is, You have to go give a talk. You got to go give a keynote. You got to go give a presentation at the company. I'm sitting in the audience. Do you care about me as your audience member? And they almost always say, well, yeah. Well, how do I know that you care about me? Well, I mean, I'm giving you information about the last financials. How do I know in the audience that you care about me and that you care about what I care about? So then the biggest way to do that is always open with a story. And if you can open with even a simple story, what happens is, remember, the story isn't about you. The story is about the audience. The story might be literally about you, but it's about opening the empathic emotional network, part of the brain of the audience. So we're going down a whole little rabbit trail here on public speaking tips, but there's so many things that people don't recognize because they don't recognize the science behind what's inhibiting their ability to be a great communicator in that setting. I can answer any other questions for you, or we can go down a different topic because I love this. I'll go crazy on it for days.
I feel like another podcast episode coming up, Jeff, where we do solely on this topic. I just want to summarize some of the things because there will be people out there where it is their greatest fear. I'll admit it's never been for me, right? As in, I don't know what it is, but maybe you and I have a coaching session one day and find out why. That I've never been nervous in public speaking. It's just never happened for me, but I know that it's some people's greatest fear. So to play back some of those tips that you gave, be authentic, be yourself. Don't try and be something that you're not. Disarm the audience as quickly as you can with something that kind of is light and refreshing. Engage the audience as early as you can. And remember that you want them in their limbic brain. You want them processing emotion. If you can remember those, that's a great start. And the other one I thought was really powerful. Once again, I've never experienced this myself, so I feel like I'm a little bit out of my depth here. But that one that you said about also give yourself, by using those processes, give yourself some time for your own cortisol to go down, will get you into a better state for the rest of the presentation as well. So I think there's some wonderful tips there, Jeff. Thank you.
Let me give you one more.
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry. I was thinking about this because one of our world-class coaches at Braintrust, Joe Massey, he's phenomenal at this. He's done a lot of study in body language and energy. And he's right. We can validate this is that when we have to do something like that, which is stressful, even for those of us who are experienced professional speakers, we still have a degree of stress, but right before we walk on the stage. And Tony Robbins is big about this. Physically release the stress backstage. And it might look silly when you're back there doing windmills with your arms, or some people I've seen do push-ups. And he's absolutely right. Physiologically, when you're about to go on a sales call or about to go give a big presentation, or if you can do something physically to release, your body will release that energy. And that's the distress it's releasing. And then you actually walk up there much more confident than you thought you were because you got rid of that stress.
The other one that you're doing there, Jeff, that's a great tip. The other one that you're doing there is when you go on stage, you're then most likely going to have an open body language as well. And people are looking at you multisensorily. And one of the things is if you've got a closed body language, it will reduce their confidence that you know what you're talking about. So you're also preparing, by doing that physical preparation off stage, you're also getting ready for a more engaging body language when you do the speech as well. Yeah, really good one, Jeff. I like that a lot. All right, that brings us to a close for today. I could talk to you for 27 hours and we would still be discovering new things, Jeff. Probably 27 days and we'd still be going, but we need to respect the time of our audience. So we'll bring it to a close now. Thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today. Thank you so much for the work that you do that continues to inspire and educate us about how the brain works and how we make decisions. It really shifted my thinking of how I see the world, and I'm hoping the audience is taking away those same things today. I'd like to go to our rapid round. So what's the one thing that you know now, Jeff, that you wish you knew when you were 20?
Yeah, that's an easy one. Now, it's probably good that I didn't know this then, because I probably would have used it for nefarious gain. But when you really understand how the human brain processes information, you can communicate in a way now, ideally for mutual benefit. I can see where people could use it for manipulation purposes, but to truly understand how we're wired biologically and know the impact that has, it would have changed the way that I communicated much earlier in life, for sure.
Okay, great. Now, what's your favorite book?
Boy, that's a tough one. I've got so many great ones that I love. I still probably go back to, Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman and Tversky. It's a heavy read, but man, it's right in my wheelhouse, right? That's the stuff I love to think about.
Great. What's your favorite quote?
Ooh, favorite quote. Boy, I just spit out a lot of them. So if I go outside of Papal Willie Bloomfield quotes, because I got a million of those, I think this was originally attributed to Einstein, who's actually my favorite figure in history. And I think this goes really well with the leaders today. I think I've always had this belief that we're all wired personally for greatness. There's a divine spark in all of us that's unique. And it's attributed to Einstein, but I think he said everybody's a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes.
That is an Einstein one. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, brilliant. And finally, I know that there's going to be many people that are listening to this, Jeff, and you've probably opened up a new world for them where they want to know more. They want to know how to put this into act. How do people get in contact with you, with Braintrust, if they want to know more about what you do and how you can help them?
Yeah, the first thing would be just to connect with me on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. That's an easy way to get tons of content. We just did a LinkedIn Live event earlier today on asking questions based on neuroscience, and we had a great turnout for that. You can go to our company website, which is braintrustgrowth.com. You can also go to my personal site if you're interested in learning more about what I speak on, which is just jeffbloomfield.com. So those are three areas. And then the last one would be the Braintrust Academy. If you want to take some of these programs in there, you can go to braintrustacademy.com. Probably more than you needed, but that's primary ways to get engaged.
Perfect, Jeff. And I'm going to put those links in the show notes as well. It makes it easier for people to find them. So once again, thank you so much, Jeff. I will say this to you many, many more times, but you've had a massive impact on my life. Such a pleasure to have you on the show so that you could share some of that wisdom, just a drop of that wisdom with our audience in the interview today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure's been on mine, Mick. Thank you.
Today's episode was brought to you by my new book, You're a Leader, Now What? The Proven Path to High Performance Leadership. The book contains many of the great lessons that we've learned together here on the Leadership Project podcast, together with lessons that I've collected over my 30-year career as a leader. The book is aimed towards first-time leaders, but really there's something in there for everyone. If you would like to show your appreciation for this show, we would greatly appreciate if you were able to go and get your copy of the book on Amazon as either an ebook or a paperback, and if you could leave us an honest review on Amazon. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Project podcast at mickspiers.com. A big call out to Faris Sadek for his sound design and editing of our audio and video content, and to the whole team at TLP, Joanne Gozon, Gerald Calabo, Rika Vidanes, and my wonderful supportive wife, Say Spiers, who is also our operations manager. This show would simply not be possible without you. If you've enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and review at Apple Podcasts. You can catch the video podcast and our video of the week at the Leadership Project YouTube channel, and you can join the conversation at the Leadership Project Facebook community group. We look forward to bringing you more great content and interviews next week as we continue to learn together and lead together. In the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and always remember to challenge the status quo.